Okay. Nothing too new to say here, I think, except to tie some things together. What does sin really consist in? And we'll go through again some of the words, right, that have been used, for sin. But in essence, different proposals have been made. So sin as essentially pride, right? That if it's really rebellion against God, then it issues from pride. There's an opinion of, and we find it even proposed by, I think Augustine proposed that as well, where sin is seen to begin in some kind of sensuality. Given into the appetites of the flesh and what the flesh wants as the bodily appetites, and then succumbing to it. Hence, for example, that the reason Eve is tempted, or Eve is tempted precisely by exploiting her appetite, her desires, but in this case, more sort of bodily desires. Others see it in the essence of sin to be in lying, deception. Perhaps even places like John 8. Let me see that quickly. John 8:44 might suggest something along those lines. John 8:44. You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. The Deuterocanonical literature in the Book of Wisdom, there's a reference there that sees sin in envy. Sin as envy, in which case, for example, the appeal to Eve, again, as God has something that you should have but you don't have, and so do what it takes to obtain it. Perhaps more holistically, somebody like Tertullian, instead, and he's followed by a number of theologians, a number of people closer home, and by Protestantism as seeing the essence of sin in doubt and unbelief. Doubt and unbelief. And seeing that as a sort of placeholder for the whole host of sin. So the sin requires that we doubt and not trust God in his law, trust especially the goodness of his law, and therefore we become inclined to disobey them. I mean, all these seem interesting enough. I see no reason why they can't be all integrated. But when we talk of sin, what really we want to highlight is this aspect of the the place of a voluntary act. A voluntary act as decisive to the various aspects of sin. Now, we've seen different words for sin. What are some of the words, Greek words for sin? Huh? Hamartia. Say again? Which means? Yeah, lawlessness. We have words that mean sin as transgression, parabasis. We have words for sin that mean misstep, to misstep, paraptoma. And we have words for sin that mean clearly a kind of stubbornness or unwillingness to hear, basically disobedience. We had that on our list yesterday. Disobedience, parakon. Our text, Romans 5 that we read, we find some of these senses from verse 12 following. So again, this is where the benefit of your knowledge of Greek comes in, right? That as you read the text in Greek, you start seeing the various nuances that are brought to the word each time, so that we don't just keep going sin. Honestly, sometimes English is not always helpful in making these kind of fine but very important distinctions. So there are different senses of sin there. Sin itself, but by that we mean all these other senses: transgression, misstep, disobedience, etc. Okay. In the Old Testament, we know that the place of law is crucial to understanding the sense of sin, especially as God begins to reveal himself to these people that he's trying to constitute as a people. The people that he himself has called in Abraham, has established a covenant with, and God begins to reveal himself and to change them, change their views on different things. Some things take much longer to change. And so there's a religious ceremonial setting in which God's nature, God's moral law is going to start unfolding. And so God would, a number of things, for example, will be prescribed to them in terms of ceremonies that would instruct them on how to worship God, how to perform different rituals, shall we call them, rituals of cleansing, rituals of being ceremonially clean, that would order how they constitute their society, that would order down to how things they eat, etc. Without going into this landmine, right, of the various aspects of the law. We want to highlight, of course, that in the Old Testament we find moral, three categories: moral law, civil law, and ceremonial law, or commandments. All of these, of course, together are working to reveal God in who he is to them and to reveal what he'll have them do. Now, as you know, coming into the New Testament, we have to put it simply, the fulfillment, right, of the ceremonial, of the civil law, even of the moral law, but all of this in a way funneling into a moral law, into the timeless revelation of God in himself and what he'll have his people do. So it's not really the case that there's no law given for people to know what is good and what is wrong deep in the Old Testament, even before God gives them a formalized law code. There's a law written on our hearts. Yesterday, I think it was you, James, you raised the question of law, right, vis-a-vis Romans 7 reading. And we did come back to that question to also underscore the place of law in revealing what was there, i.e. sin, right? The law in revealing and showing and deepening the sense of sin as a nature, and also just basically showing me when I transgress. Because if there's no nomos, if there's no standard, how do you measure transgression? So what is God's law in terms of revealing what sin is? Because clearly we're saying the nature of sin has to do with what? Transgression, has to do with misstepping, has to do with disobeying. Then what is God's law? What of people who do not know God's law? Can they be guilty of sinning?
But they are still without excuse.
They're without excuse, the scripture says. Why? Because it affirms that there's some kind of access to what we know more fully in terms of God's law as revealing his nature and calling us to relationship with him. But there is a witness to what God commands. So first of all, we can underscore the importance that without law, there's no sin. Yes? Where there's no law, there's no sin. Isn't that the point that's made in Romans 7? There's no sin in the sense of there's no knowledge of sin. Yes? For, how would I have known if the law had not said, thou shalt not, ... and whatever action, whatever act you can fill in there. Now, for those who do not know the Old Testament law, how do they come to know the thou shalt not, or the witness of conscience in saying thou shalt not? How do they come to know this? Well, we're talking here of a kind of inner witness, isn't there, of of conscience. The witness of conscience, what else is there? You spoke about God's law written in nature. And as we see in Romans 1 and 2, God, there's a charge against everyone because there's a measure to which you ought to know. Shall we, let me read some of that, just a second. Romans, let's go back to it. So, Romans chapter 1, from verse 18, it starts talking about, how God's wrath is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Suppress what is known, right, as the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. They've been clearly perceived, Scripture says, in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they were not his people, but they knew God. They did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. And we highlighted this, I think it was yesterday. In that condition, God truly given them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. Now you see the unfolding of the self-deception that we're talking about. The self-deception. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And if you go down to chapter 2, verse 1, therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. So the Bible is very clear about this. First, the need of God's law, that God's law is in fact in place, and that sin has to do with breaking, with transgressing, with misstepping that law. Now, if we're talking in terms of law, then this brings very central into the equation the aspect of will and knowing. In the text we just read, Paul is insisting on the aspect of a conscious knowing, and still insisting on the aspect of a conscious choosing against. Now you say, but is it just because their nature is so inclined? As we've been underscoring the importance of nature, sinful nature. But that doesn't at all absolve from the place there of human responsibility vis-a-vis sin, because it's transgression, it's the breaking of. And hence, that man is without excuse. When God charges all of humanity as guilty before him, it's not an unjust sentence in any way. It's a perfectly just sentence that in a real active sense, all have sinned and therefore have fallen short of the glory of God, which precisely is another of the definitions of sin. To fall short, to not make it to the mark. And in this case, the mark of the glory of God. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So, for there to be sin, there has to be law. For there to be law is because God has already given it. And we're saying it's not just in the restricted form of the written code that was given to Moses and the children of Israel, but there's a certain universality of access to the law of God that clearly Romans here takes very seriously. And it's because of this that we're without excuse and therefore deserving of the verdict. So there's an access, we're saying, to the law that is deep also in the heart of man. Even though, as Romans 1 would say what we just read, there's an active suppressing of it. There's an active suppressing of the voice of conscience. When you read Dostoevsky, look out for that. When you read Crime and Punishment. Especially in the way it's fleshed out, so that we don't just talk about it as if we're just given a proposition. This is a very rich existential phenomenon that if we're not careful, we ourselves do. The active sense in which when your mind is really set on something that your will wants to do, even when you know it's not right, you want to tone down every voice that is pushing against and reminding you of what God's law is in that thing. And so what you find there is a rich exploration through this Raskolnikov of different ways in which we are actively in our hearts still doing that, still suppressing the voice of the Spirit. So there's a deep heart issue here. There's a deep heart issue. Let's come to some of the essentials of sin. Some essentials of sin, and let's run through a list, and then we can come back and flesh some of it out. A number of, if we're saying that sin has to do with breaking God's law in the various ways we've underscored, then we can say more. We can say more about when we ask what then is this essence? What is the essential, as Bavin calls it, of sin? And he constantly, along with many Reformation theologians, make the point that sin is not to be understood as something positively existing in itself. They're supposed to be understood as a defect, a privation, a kind of absence, a weakness, an imbalance, something lacking, properly a falling short. Sin is a falling short. So and this is the other sense of transgressing the law, we fall short of reaching and fulfilling what God positively in his law wants us to do. So it's in that sense that we transgress it. We fall short. In this case, we fall short of the glory of God. There's this insistence that sin has to do with defects, has to do with a deficiency. A deficiency in the sense of what should be there is not there. So, properly speaking, a privation. Bathing, as you'd have seen or you will see in your reading, makes us appreciate, I think, the difference between negation and privation. Did anybody see what that difference is? What's the difference between sin as negation or sin as a deficiency or a privation? What's the difference? It's an important one. A stone cannot fly. A stone and flying, negation. A human that's blind, privation. Why? A human being, the complete state is that they should be able to see, but then they're lacking the ability to see. So in that way, in that sense, they're deficient in something that is constitutive of who and what they are. A stone not being able to fly. Your reaction is what? What? Right? Like, what are we talking about here? What world are we? Although these sort of examples, sometimes a bit, because we live in such a world where the fantasy is very real, in a sense, right? Not least in the world of gaming. So all kinds of things that make some of these examples break down sometimes occur, but, whatever. So it's being without. Negation is a matter of being without, and privation is lacking something essential to life. Okay, so essentials of sin. So, one, that sin is not a substance. Sin doesn't have its own substantial or positive existence. Instead, sin is a deformation of existence. It's both a deformation of existence and it deforms existence. So when we sin, when we give in to the lusts and the temptation of sin, we are missing the mark, absolutely. We're missing the mark of God's law. But then what's happening there is what? Giving power to this, for the law of sin to operate in our members. And Paul conceives of it in this sense too. It's a deformation. It's not a substance. It's a deformation of existence. It also is, as we've said, sin is first privation. It's not its own. Sin is privation. It's a privation as a result of what is God's good and perfect law and will. So it deprives us of that. It was Augustine in his diatribe against Manichaeanism that he came from, that said sin is something done or said or desired contrary to eternal law. The law that is truly eternal is the divine reason or will of God, which demands the preservation of the natural order and forbids its disturbance. We can go further. There's this. So, let's go this way. If indeed sin is these things, we've been also underscoring the fact that it pertains, especially when you think of it in terms of guilt, it pertains to rational creatures. Whether we're looking at it in terms of perhaps the first fall of spiritual beings in the heavenlies. The Bible doesn't give us that much insight into that. But we know there's something of that nature that's happened. Whether through Ezekiel or through Job, we know something like this. But the essence is that it's the exercise of a gift God has given to rational creatures in breaking God's moral law. And so there's an aspect of the voluntary. Augustine it was who said, in fact, sin is so much a voluntary evil that it is not sin at all unless it is voluntary. Sin is so much a voluntary evil that it is not sin at all unless it is voluntary. Now, this can be qualified, especially when we think about it in terms of the origins of sin. In the first Adam, for example. But at its heart, though, we will sin. Sin needs voluntas, the willing of it. Now we could ask the question, well, how about, then what do we do when we're so powerfully inclined towards a specific sin, let's say, that we're not even able to will against it. Basically, we just succumb to it. I wouldn't really take us through this Roman Catholic teaching that makes the distinction between venial and mortal sins. Have you heard this distinction? Who was you are the previous Catholic? Venial and mortal sins. So it's really built on trying to make a distinction between different levels of desires in the soul. That there's some that arise in us spontaneously before the consent of the will. That some desires arise without our will consenting, and therefore, when we give in to those desires, they incline us in such a way that we've not really willed those things. Some other desires kind of arise in us, but they overpower us that we're not able to resist them. And it's almost like we just fall to them. We try to resist, but they overpower us. So we call those are venial sins. And then some are more through willful desires. We will actively will those kinds of desires, and we're talking a lot yesterday about the example of the guy who sits and premeditates all the various aspects and how he's going to commit this murder, for example. He wills every bit of it, his murderous intent, and he brings it to pass. And so those ones willfully carried out are said to be mortal sins. Whether we make this sort of distinctions or not, the fact is that already we've talked about the imputation of sin. That guilt is already a given. So all are already in our hearts in enmity against God. The heart actively being in enmity with God. And then in this state of the heart, there are then active commissions of sin. In a pastoral context, somebody has lost their newborn, their baby, and they are worried that this baby didn't have the opportunity to receive Christ and be saved. And the week before, you taught very powerfully on original sin at church. And this happens during the week. And they come to you worried about what could have happened to their child, or what the fate of their child is. What do you tell them? Yeah, I think that's very pastorally wise. You don't want to give false hopes that you know are not necessarily biblical. And this is not a far-fetched example, by the way, right? This is very possible to happen. Yeah, I think this, in the end, underscores the aspect of mystery. The need, what I emphasized yesterday, that theology, our reading of scriptures, our following and walking with the Lord, walking in the fear of the Lord, that all of this happens in the shadow of God's mystery. that as much as God brings enough clarity to us on different aspects of doctrine, of his own, of his nature, of ethical questions and how we deal with others, etc. That as much as we see light, sometimes at the best of times we can only see dimly. We can only see enough of what God allows for us to see. And so if we do not recognize, or if we naively think that what we see is in fact all there is to God, and there's not more, and there's not deeper, and there are not things that the Lord has left in his eternal counsel, then we will have the kind of pride and theological arrogance that things we've set it all up into nice categories and that's it. And sometimes pastorally this can be quite disastrous if the pastor or the teacher or whatever does not have the same the sense of mystery and a humble sort of carefulness with these kind of questions. So from a pastoral point of view, I think you rightly touched on it, that first is to recognize the sensitivity of what you're dealing with. Right? And to let that inform how you dish the meal, to let that inform how we speak what we know to be in Scripture, and also how we recognize what we don't know enough of. And there's a section in our reading there on the aspect of mystery as we think about sin. And it's precisely from a pastoral point of view in these sort of situations that we need that as a sort of controlling, broad oversight of how we do theology. And again, I've underscored here that when we say mystery, we don't mean enigma. The mystery of God is not the enigma of God, that we just need more data points and then we'll know it all. It's the sense that there's an unbridgeable divide between uncreated and created. And so all the relations with God is in mystery. It's in the mystery of God. And as we approach his invitation, as he invites us in to see more and more and to walk deeper with him. Yeah, I just want to thank all of you for your attention, for a lot of the rich engagements we've had. It's really been very pleasurable for me. I found great delight in our teachings, in our discussions, learning together, looking at God's word together. And I pray that we'll continue to do this, not always together, but individually, wherever the Lord places us.